welcome. I see there are still people coming in, so we'll wait maybe one more minute and then we'll start. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christine Menzel, and I'm the coordinator of the BIOPAMA program for the Eastern and Southern African region. Welcome to all of you that have joined us today for this online event. There are still people joining, but in the interest of time and for all of you that have joined us on time, we do want to get going. So first, I wanted to just very briefly introduce the BIOPAMA program. And so I will ask for the next slide to be please put on. First of all, and on behalf of the IUCN Regional Office for Eastern and Southern Africa, I want to welcome all of you to this event on conservation trust funds. This event is the fourth in a series of BIOPAMA online events on the topic of sustainable financing for protected areas, protected and conserved areas. And it's also part of a broader online program on protected areas known as the Vital Sites. This is a program leading up to the IUCN World Conservation Congress, which unfortunately has been indefinitely postponed, and we will hope to hear early next year if that will proceed. So this event is made possible through the Biodiversity and Protected Areas Management Program, BIOPAMA. So I've referred to the acronym a few times already, but now you know what it means. And I want to just briefly say a few words about what it is. BIOPAMA is an initiative of the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States and is financed by the European Union's 11th European Development Fund. It's implemented jointly by IUCN and the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. And then we also have additional partners in each of the ACP regions that host the observatories for biodiversity information. The broad goal of BIOPAMA is to address priorities of the ACP region for improved management and governance of biodiversity and natural resources, with a specific focus on three main areas of work. Next slide, please. So the first area of work of BIOPAMA is what we call the Regional Resource Hub. This is the observatories that I referred to earlier. For the Eastern and Southern African region, we call it the Regional Resource Hub. And it's hosted by the Regional Center for Mapping of Resources for Development, RCMRD, for this region. The Regional Resource Hub incorporates what we call the Regional Reference Information System, which has been developed by the Joint Research Center and supports tracking of global biodiversity targets against the CBD and Aichi targets. So the Regional Resource Hub is essentially a hub for information and also tools to support decision-making for effective protected and conserved areas management. So that's the sort of first area of work of BIOPAMA. The second area of work in the BIOPAMA program is around capacity building. So that's through training as well as knowledge and information exchange. Currently, most of that is obviously online because of the global situation. But hopefully, well, in the past and also hopefully in the very near future, we will be able to have physical training events again. And the focus here is on both data management related topics so that we can support the development of the Regional Resource Hub, as well as directly, obviously, protected area management and governance topics. So both of those are focus areas for our capacity building. And then the third area of work in BIOPAMA is the action component, which is a competitive granting mechanism that seeks to improve on-the-ground management and governance in protected areas. And we just had an information session this morning for one of the calls that is open. So it's available to the whole Eastern and Southern African region directly for protected areas, protected and conserved areas. So BIOPAMA essentially seeks to support more effective and fair protected areas through assessments, planning, decision, and action through these various different components that I've just described. So if you haven't done so already, please do visit the BIOPAMA website for more information. And that's also where you'll find information on past events, training opportunities, as well as the grants that are available. Now, next slide, please. Moving on to the specific topic of our discussion today. During the first event in the series of webinars, which was held on the 30th of July, 2020, we launched a report, which was also commissioned by BIOPAMA, called Closing the Gap, Financing and Resourcing of Protected and Conserved Areas in Eastern and Southern Africa. And you can see the link on the screen at the moment and a picture of the cover. And this report basically provides an overview of the current status of protected area finance in the region and explores different finance mechanisms that might be used to help decrease the existing and often quite significant funding gaps in these areas. It's available on the BIOPAMA website as well, and in case you don't have a copy yet, it's well worth the read. And during the first event, we asked participants of that event to also prioritize their interests in the various finance mechanisms and approaches that are outlined in this publication. And this essentially guided our choice of topic for the deep dive sessions that we have subsequently held. And this is now the third deep dive session. The first one was on collaborative management. The second one was on payment for ecosystem services. And today we're taking a closer look at conservation trust funds. Maybe just a note here that all of the sessions are recorded, and you can find the recordings of the past sessions as well on the BIOPAMA website. So feel free to have a look at those too. But back to conservation trust funds. There are many different models of trust funds supporting conservation and natural resource management across the world and also in this region. And in this session, we'll be hearing from our panelists an outline of these various models, as well as some panelists describing very specific examples of functioning CTFs in this region. And we're also looking forward to hearing from you, your questions and insights on the topic. So please do feel free to also share in the comment section and also ask your questions in the Q&A section that's available in this Zoom. And in order to help us design subsequent online events, I'm going to do a quick punt here that at the end of this session, we would like to ask for your feedback. So we have a small questionnaire that we will be posting the link to at the end. And don't worry, we'll remind you and we'll post the link. And we really would ask that you provide your feedback so that you can help us to make sure that our next webinars are very focused and addressing issues that you are interested in, obviously within the framework of the BIOPAMA context. But we are planning quite a number for 2021, and so we want to make sure that they're as relevant as possible, and I'd ask you to please complete that survey. So now I'd like to move on to the panel session, and I'm delighted that we have such a great group of distinguished panelists with us again today that will share their experiences from across the region. And to take us through this, I would like to hand over to Kathleen Fitzgerald, who will introduce the panelists and also moderate the discussion today. Kathleen is a partner at Conservation Capital, where she's focusing on increasing revenue for protected area management and wildlife conservation. Kathleen also serves as a senior conservation advisor to the African Wildlife Foundation. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Kathleen. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Christine. And welcome, everyone. It's really fun to see Croatia, Namibia, Uganda in the chat. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. And thank you so much for joining. As Christine mentioned, this is the fourth in a series focused on protected area finance. And we've had incredible participation as we do today. And I think it's for three reasons. Number one, I think everyone on this webinar recognizes there is a significant funding gap for conservation and biodiversity protection. Just recently, the Paulson Institute released a report, and they estimated there's a $711 billion gap every year for biodiversity. So we're hungry for solutions for how we can increase revenue for protected areas. The second reason is everyone recognizes the need for sustainable funding mechanisms, and conservation trust funds is one of those solutions. And so I'm delighted to be talking about that today. And the third is what we've lived through this year with COVID. And what COVID has done is it's exposed the fragility of our conservation system and our finance model. And so we do need new solutions. And so I think that's why we have so many people here with us today. So the panel today, I'm really delighted, an exceptional group of conservation experts who have practical experience in conservation trust funds. I'm going to introduce them all briefly now. I'd urge you to look at their bios. If I read them, we would all be here all day. So I'm not going to read them in full, but I'll start by introducing Katie Mathias, who is Conservation Finance Project Manager with Wildlife Conservation Society. And Katie's joining us this morning for her from the state of Washington. Katie has experience in finance, nonprofit management, resource mobilization, and governance. She's the co-author of the annual Conservation Trust Investment Survey, which really looks at investment management practices for conservation trust funds. She also focuses on broader conservation finance within WCS and also with partner organizations. And Katie was one of the key authors in a recent report, which she will talk with us about today, which looked at the last 10 years of conservation. It's an incredible resource. I would urge you to read it. And Katie helped launch that a few weeks ago. So welcome, Katie, and thank you for getting up so early, but delighted to have you. Next, we'll hear from Sean Nazarelli, who is the Director of Innovative Finance with the BioFund. So Sean's coming to us today from Mozambique. He's a biodiversity and natural resource specialist who has 25 years of experience in international development, and he's spent the last 18 years in Mozambique. Sean is the co-author of the feasibility study on sustainable financing of conservation areas in Mozambique, and is one of the authors of the current financial plan looking at the protected area estate in Mozambique. And he's been involved with the BioFund since the beginning, since it was created in 2011. And as the Director of Innovative Finance, he's now looking at different innovative ways to increase revenue, biodiversity offsets, PES, private sector investment. And we'll be hearing a lot more about that from Sean. So welcome, Sean. Moving inland and to East Africa, welcome to Mark David Mime from the Bwindi Mkahinga Trust. Mark is the Executive Director and the Trust Administrator for the Bwindi Mkahinga Conservation Trust. And unlike the BioFund, which focuses on an entire country, Mark is going to talk with us today about a conservation trust fund, which is really focused on two particular protected areas and the communities that live in and around those conservation areas. The fund is also celebrating 25 years, so it's a really poignant time to look back on the Bwindi Mkahinga Conservation Trust Fund. And Mark, prior to leading the fund, worked for the International Gorilla Conservation Program in Rwanda, Uganda, and DRC. He was instrumental in a number of community and conservation initiatives in that greater Virunga landscape, giving him a real understanding of the conservation challenges and dynamics in that area. So welcome, Mark. And last, certainly not least, welcome Martin Boystrom, who is with KfW and comes from Germany today. Martin is with KFW, and prior to joining KFW, he was with FAO, GIZ. For example, he was the country manager at GIZ, responsible for their portfolio in Mauritania, Morocco, and Tunisia. Since 2000, he has been with GIZ, and he initially focused on water and health sector for KFW in Rwanda and Tanzania, and then later on natural resources, initially focusing on Mauritania and Cape Verde. Since 2006, Martin has been responsible for natural resources in the Congo Basin, and since 2014, he's focused on Madagascar. And Martin's been involved with conservation trust funds since 2006. He was a member from 2007 to 2012 of the board of directors for the Trinational de la Sangha Foundation in Central Africa. And he's also project manager for the FAPBM Conservation Fund in Madagascar. So Martin brings great knowledge and experience in conservation trust funds. So welcome to all the panelists. I'd like to start with Katie, who has agreed to provide an overview of conservation trust funds. When I look at the participants, we have some directors of conservation trust funds, such as Finoso from the BioGuinea Foundation, and people who are new to conservation trust funds. So Katie will walk that line, describe conservation trust funds, and tell us about the trends. So welcome, Katie.
Great, Kathleen, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you. It's great to be with you. I wish I could be with you in person, if we could all be together in person, but this is a great alternative to that. So I am going to try to give both an overview of what conservation trust funds are, and then share some of the trends and the evolution that we've been seeing of CTFs over the last 10 years, with a bit of a look towards what we anticipate seeing in the future. So let me first just start with an overview. If we can move to the next slide, please. So conservation trust funds are private, legally independent, mission-driven institutions. And one of the key, I think, realizations that people are increasingly coming to is that trust funds are more than a single financing mechanism. They really are robust institutions that provide longevity and sustainability in protected area management, conservation, and increasingly in climate adaptation and mitigation and sustainable livelihoods. Their role is conservation finance, not implementation of programs and projects. So they are not on the ground doing conservation work. They're mobilizing resources from a variety of sources to the ground to community-based, locally managed conservation work, work in the fields. They use a variety of mechanisms to do that, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. But they're funding NGOs, they're funding community-based organizations, small and medium productive enterprises, and governmental agencies, which can include protected area management agencies as well. So one of the unique roles that they embody and that they are uniquely positioned to do is to translate international priorities to the ground, to field conservation that's happening in the communities that they know so well. So they're taking international priorities, best science, and the national commitments of their countries to livelihood programs, to conservation and climate projects, and to protected area management. It's an important balance between maintaining legal independence and partnering closely with government. So if we can move to the next slide, please. This is information that's coming from the Conservation Trust Funds 2020, which is a report we just released that Kathleen mentioned. So what we found through a recent survey of CTFs, that there are 108, give or take, conservation trust funds around the world, either in current operation or in development. They are, as you can see from the map, spread globally, although tending to concentrate in the global south and in the tropics, particularly and understandably in areas of highest biodiversity. They have been around for 20 to 30 years. Kathleen mentioned that the Burundi Makasine Conservation Trust Fund is celebrating, I think, 20 years. We have some that are approaching their 25th and 30th anniversaries. So there was a real push to create conservation trust funds in the mid-90s, and many of them date back to that. But we've also seen at least 40 conservation trust funds that have been created in the last 10 years, since 2010. So there certainly is a massive growth in the use of conservation trust funds as a financing mechanism for protected area management, for climate adaptation, and for other conservation projects. We also saw over that 10-year period that 14 have closed. Those have been for a variety of reasons. There's really no single cause of that, although in some cases it really is part of a planned closure, that the trust fund had a limited time frame from the beginning, and that it wound down as its funding and its work were completed. And in aggregate, conservation trust funds are managing nearly $2 billion in invested assets in the capital markets that they use to fund their conservation work. We can move to the next slide. A couple of the key attributes that we see in conservation trust funds, certainly in best practice conservation trust funds. I mentioned legal independence. They're set up as legally independent institutions, but they work closely with government, and these partnerships are vital to them accomplishing their work and to operating successfully. So even though they may not be legally structured within government, they operate in alignment with government priorities and with government strategies. They excel at transparent reporting and in strong administration, both in their grant making, in their monitoring and evaluation, in their financial management. And they have a long-term focus and continuity. They're there to provide long-term sustainable funding and sustainable commitment to conservation and to climate. So we have seen conservation trust funds providing stability during times of political upheaval. We've certainly seen many conservation trust funds, BioFund is an excellent example of this, who have been able to provide continuity and stability during the turmoil that we're seeing with COVID and the impact that that's had on protected area finance. So that long-term sustainable focus has been vital to the conservation community and to conservation work. A typical structure that we see, not all of them will follow this exact model, but what we typically see in the way that conservation trust funds are set up is that there will be a strong board of trustees led by a president and with the typical officers of the secretary and treasurer, that the trustees bring an important mix of their own experience and expertise in the relevant grant making areas, as well as in government and governance, fundraising, and other key technical areas. The board is structured with committees that support their work and that may bring on additional experts who are not board members, but who participate in the committees. Typically, we see a grant making committee, finance and audit, and an investment committee. And then there may be an outside technical and science or other advisory committees that provide technical expertise to the board and often to the secretariat as well. So the board hires and oversees an executive director who leads a technical secretariat. The staff size of secretariats vary widely depending on the scope of work that the Conservation Trust Fund is responsible for. But in addition to an executive director, we also often see a program officer or a grant making officer. We'll see a finance leader and additional technical staff depending again on the specific needs of the CTF. It could be fundraising, communications, other administrative and logistics staff. And then the secretariat will, with the board, hire outside professionals as needed. So that can certainly include professional investment advisors, people who are trained and experts in investment management, who are working as part of investment management firms, and who also hire the external auditors who at the very least, are auditing the financials, but may also be doing additional program audits, both for donors and for transparency as a whole. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So conservation trust funds, as I mentioned, are using a variety of financing mechanisms. They're drawing from a wide range of sources, and this diversification is important both in the sources and the instruments that they're using, because we certainly found that over-reliance on any single source or any single financing mechanism can be particularly challenging when we run into disruptions. And you know, certainly one of the key disruptions we're seeing now is the impact of COVID on tourism revenue. So diversification is one of the tools that helps to at least to mitigate some of the risk that comes from any single source or any single instrument just being disrupted. So typical sources, the multilateral agencies, bilateral donors, national government funding is a critical source of funding for protected areas and for conservation trust funds specifically. Increasingly, the private sector plays a role in the funding that conservation trust funds are drawing on, non-governmental organizations as well, and private foundations. They're using, as I mentioned, a wide mix of instruments. Most conservation trust funds started with some combination of an endowment or a sinking fund or a revolving fund, but they've broadened and diversified. And increasingly what we're seeing is that conservation trust funds are now starting with a diversified portfolio of instruments. So rather than starting with an endowment and then expanding down the road as they see that they need more diversification, the newer conservation trust funds are planning that diversification into their business plans as they get started. And CTFs, again, while they originally used particularly small grants and direct protected area finance, we're seeing a diversification in the types of programs that they're using to fund conservation projects. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Kathleen mentioned two reports that we've recently launched through the Conservation Finance Alliance. The first is called Conservation Trust Funds 2020, which is a 10-year review, or just a little more than 10-year review of conservation trust funds, looking back at trends and evolution and looking ahead to what we might see in the future. That was a report that CFA contracted Wolf's Company and Aligning Visions to develop and produce in conjunction with its partner project, which was an update to the practice standards for conservation trust funds, which are a set of best practices and evidence-based norms around excellence in CTFs, what donors expect, what stakeholders and other observers of CTFs expect in terms of transparency and accountability. Those have been distilled into a set of practice standards. And we see those being used in by established CTFs in development and growth as an institution, as well as by new CTFs in designing themselves from the ground up. So both of these reports are available on the Conservation Finance Alliance website. I can put the links up. The links are already in the chat. So if you want to visit these reports, they're available for you to read through. I'll talk about some of the key findings that we discovered through the Conservation Trust Fund's 2020 analysis. And this drew on a variety of sources, numerous interviews with stakeholders, but particularly new this year was a global survey of conservation trust funds where we had responses from 50 CTFs from around the world. It gave us a fairly robust body of data about conservation trust funds, what they are doing and how they're performing. So I'm going to move a little bit quickly through some of these facts, but they're all available in the report. We can move to the next slide, please. So in terms of some of the programmatic evolution that we've seen over the last 10 years, I think one of the key points that I make is that while terrestrial conservation continues to be a critical component of the work that CTFs are funding, there's been a significant increase in the role of marine and coastal systems in the work that CTFs are doing, with over 45% of CTFs now funding marine and coastal conservation in addition to forest conservation and terrestrial work. Over 2/3 of CTFs are funding capacity building among their grantees, not just the direct work that they're doing, but their grantees' ability to report, to monitor, and to deliver on their conservation work. We're seeing a significant number of CTFs engaged in law and policy work around mainstreaming biodiversity into national policies. And again, 2/3 are working on economic livelihoods, which is a critical role that CTFs play in achieving the balance between ensuring that the communities that are managing and living in protected areas and conserved areas also have funding to ensure both food security and income security. So if we move ahead, please. I mentioned a lot about where the funding has come from. I just highlight that in the last 10 years, conservation trust funds that added $570 million to their endowments and $560 million to sinking funds. So there has been a continued commitment to funding conservation trust funds and a lot of work by CTFs to bring funding into the conservation space. There's been a lot of exciting growth. We can move ahead, please. I mentioned the importance of diversification, and this is a little hard to see, but if you look at the contrast between the light green bars, which show where funding was coming from over the last 10 years versus where conservation trust funds anticipate drawing funding from over the next 10 years, one of the key areas of growth that we're seeing is the importance of partnerships with the private sector, that there will be growth in those partnerships in particular. And if we can move ahead, please. And then increasingly, we're seeing that the role of partnerships are going to be critical to where conservation trust funds are deploying funds over the next 10 years. So while there has been a significant amount of work in small grants or even medium-sized grants, moving forward, there'll be greater diversification into different types of financing mechanisms and different tools of financing protected area work on the ground and community conservation on the ground. I'm going to talk real quickly about asset management and then a little bit about the future. So as I mentioned, conservation trust funds are managing close to $2 billion in investment assets that they use to fund their conservation work. They're generating returns that pay for conservation on ideally a reliable and sustained basis. We did an analysis to look at how they're managing their endowments, and what we found is that really only about 20% of the CTFs are achieving the types of returns that meet global expectations, where you would expect and hope to see the endowments able to fund 3 to 4% per year of the endowment capital in conservation funding. We're really only seeing about 1/5 of the CTFs able to sustainably achieve that while also growing at the rate of inflation. But we did see a number of top performers, and consistently what we saw among those top performers who are meeting expectations, who are beating benchmarks, is that they have a diversified asset allocation, that they're holding their investments in hard currencies, and they're using external professional investment advisors. And then I'll just wrap up quickly by giving a quick look to the future. What we are anticipating for CTFs, I mentioned the importance of diversification and growth in the types of programs that they're funding. CTFs are going to play a critical role in the emerging blue and green economies, particularly the blue and green economy recovery that we see coming out of COVID, or that we hope to see coming out of COVID soon. And increasing involvement with debt conversions and other types of debt solutions, mainstreaming biodiversity into infrastructure investments, an increasing role in compensation and offset mechanisms, which I'm sure Sean will talk about, and a general evolution of how how we engage in production economies around food and agriculture, around small and medium enterprises, and in all the collaboration globally, what we hope to see in integrating conservation into sustainable economies globally. So with that, thank you, and I will turn it back to Kathleen.
Great, thanks, Katie. That was really informative. And again, the two reports that Katie referenced are in the chat, and I would strongly urge you to take a look at that report, which looks at the 10 years of CTFs, and also the standards, which have been updated. Really great guidelines for CTFs. So thank you, Katie, really informative. We had a question while you were speaking from Yannick, which was about protected areas. And I just want to highlight to Yannick and others that when we're referring to protected areas, we're talking about the IUCN 1 through 6. And so we have seen CTFs for national parks and also for community conservation areas. And so I think you'll hear from Mark, for example, when he talks about the Bwindi and Mkahinga Conservation Trust, while it's focused on those protected areas, the level of community investment and development that the trust fund is doing is quite significant. So I wanted to answer Yannick's question. And if any of you have questions for Katie, please type it in the chat, and we will get to that after we hear from the other panelists. So over to Mozambique. Sean, welcome again, in BioFund, and what the fund is doing and some of the innovative work that you're undertaking.
Okay, sure. Thanks very much, Kathleen, and thank you very much, BIOPAMA, for the invite to this webinar. If you can put the slides up, I'll just really quickly run through a few things. People who may know us, may not know us, you can put the next slide up. And that's just a brief, who are we? Where is Mozambique? Newer funds in the last 10 years, but we were officially launched only in 2015. We have more than 50 members as part of our institution. We're a little bit different than most trust funds in that we have a membership body. Next slide. We operate with three strategic pillars. The first of them is consolidating ourselves as a newish fund. We still need to work on that. The second is our core business, the financing contribution of conservation. And then the third is recognizing that we need to operate within a context of many more actors. We work on creating an enabling environment. Next slide, please. In terms of endowment, we've been quite successful in raising our endowment, much of this money coming from KfW. In fact, Martin, thank you very much, as well as from the government of Mozambique, from the GEF, and the World Bank, and Conservation International. So we've had a steady growth. We have managed to hit our targets of over 3% per year net return. In fact, we're up around nearly 5%, 5.5% in gross return over the existence of our endowment. Next slide. With that, we've been able to, since we started distributing money in 2016 with just one single beneficiary, we're now up to this year, 2020, we have more than 30 beneficiaries. And in total, we've distributed since the entire country. This is most of the protected area network at this point. We're now looking at something like 12 million hectares of biodiversity protection areas are benefiting from our support. Next slide. Having got the basics right and getting a lot of donor funding, I was asked to spend a few minutes just talking about innovative finance, and having that basis allows us now also the freedom to work on innovative finance mechanism. And the most important one of that for Mozambique is biodiversity offsets, where we've been working for a number of years. We have some money now to do some pilot work, and we'll start some pilot works in 2021. We're already working for the next couple of years on developing national legislation for that, together with the relevant Ministry of the Environment. And that should be passed next year. We have some support funds. We started an emergency fund this year, which was particularly interesting in order to substitute tourism revenue, which was funding frontline ranger personnel in many of the protected areas. They all were suddenly without an income and therefore suddenly without the ability to pay salaries. We assumed that responsibility. We're currently paying a third of the rangers in the countries their full salaries, and another third we're supporting with their operational costs in the field. That's their food rations, their uniforms, their communications. Allowing them to continue to get out there into the bush and do the really important work they do. Some work on some environmental services, payment for environmental services, some collaborations with local private sector. This is a debit card here in the corner, that carton view, which one of the local banks gives us a very small percentage of what they make. But since we have thousands and thousands of people who have adhered to this, it's now generating us over $50,000 a year. Next slide, please. So that's who we are, and that's what we've been doing. So I just wanted to sort of focus here. We see that here in Mozambique, conservation is development. It's an alternative way of developing the country. It does not rely necessarily on intensive extraction, but instead on developing that natural resource base and providing that natural resource economy. And it employs at this point thousands of people. It could employ many, many thousands more. And it's our goal in the future to be as supportive as possible in making this entire sector grow dramatically. So thanks very much to all of you, and I think I managed to stay within time. Thanks.
Fantastic, Sean, and a great example of a successful conservation trust fund. And your key point, well, there were lots of key points, but I think the one point that you made, which really strikes home for a lot of people, is you created the fund, and now with that security, you're able to be more creative and maybe take some more risks in terms of testing out offsets and PES, and how phenomenal that the fund is now supporting rangers throughout the country. Really impressive. And I suspect there will be lots of questions for you about what made that possible. So shifting from a country level conservation trust fund, I'm going to hand it over to Mark, who can talk about a geographically explicit conservation trust fund, and that's the Bwindi Mkahinga Conservation Trust Fund. So welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad I'm here on this panel, and I am enjoying what I'm hearing. So it's what we believe in. Bwindi Mkahinga Conservation Trust was established in 1994 and registered in Ugandan law, supported by Global Environment Fund and the government of Uganda. And we are specifically looking at an area. I'm sorry I didn't bring them up, but I would have done it. We have two protected areas in Uganda: Bwindi Impenetrable National Park and Bwindi Mkahinga Gorilla National Parks, where the mountain gorillas are. So the trust fund was formed strictly to look at conserving the gorillas in perpetuity. Our vision is biodiversity and ecosystem health of Bwindi Impenetrable National Park and Mkahinga conserved in harmony with the development needs of the communities. And we do this through a lot of things, which is sustainable. We invest in sustainable tourism, collaborative community development, research, and funding park management. And in doing this, we are actually implementing, because at the time of setup, there were no NGOs that we would work with. So we are implementing, and recently we've started working with partners who have come on board, and we are using three-pillar approach. We do programs and projects which we are strengthening. We create conservation awareness, and we also do community conservation activities, especially with regard to sustainable conservation, tree planting, water harvesting, and helping marginalized communities that used to live in these forests that were turned into national parks because of barriers. Next slide, please. Next slide. What have we been able to achieve? We have actually been conserving and funding activities since 1994, which is 25 years ago. And in 6 years past, with the 6 million fund that we've been having, we managed to get 5.7 million profit. And of this, we've invested 2.7 million US dollars in community activities around Windy. We are doing community projects supported by donors over and above the 2.7. We write proposals and get funding where we invest further in the communities, in sustainable land use management, in tree planting, in wood plots, in creating tree nurseries, in setting up energy saving stoves to fight climate change. And we also now have started giving community grants to men and women and youth to start their own small activities, especially in village savings and loans and other enterprises for their livelihood improvement. Next. We give grants to communities, and our focus has been to make sure that we get more women involved in community grants. And we target 60% women and 40% men, and we are successfully reaching there with bringing women on board and youth. Next. In soil and water conservation, one of the biggest challenges we have in Windy is that our land is hilly. And it's not only hilly, we are densely populated. We have the highest density in Uganda, 700 people to 800, and some places 850 people per square kilometer. And this makes land to be stressed. So we are using modern methods to bring the agriculture to earth with land use methods that are helping the land to be sustained better. With plants and cows, we give cows to people and then use cow dung to fertilize instead of using artificial fertilizers. We have built a big gravity scheme in an area which was starved of water. We served 30,000 people with 72 substands, and we had 40 schools also giving water, where we have water school system also. Next. In making Windy and Mugahinga national parks, there were communities that were used to live in the forest, the Batwa. And when they made the national parks, the Batwa were left without a home. So we have been helping them to establish a home. We have bought them land. We have taught their children, given them scholarships, and we are now building them houses. We have already built over 77 houses, and we are making them to have a permanent home outside their forest to feel a belonging, and we give them packages to start their own life. And this has been very helpful to them. And if I had time, I would show you more pictures of where they were and how they have moved. Next, please. And one of the things that I was saying is about enterprise development. One of the things that people now feel is very important for them is tourism. And we have helped them to understand what tourists want through training. They now make very good baskets. Based on the culture, they make beads. They are starting to make ornaments from bone and horn and stones, the volcanic stones in Mugahinga. So very soon we shall be, when COVID stops and tourists start flowing in, our people will be able to get another alternative diversified income stream. Next. Why I wanted to end with this slide to show you that we have limited land, but we have people who are very innovative, who are working with us using modern methods to improve, can produce food for them sustainably. So we work with them to develop programs to make them practice sustainable agriculture, to get a livelihood from it, and also to get food, for food security and sustainable income. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. That was fantastic and really great to see next to Sean's presentation again on a countrywide approach, your trust focusing in on a particular area. And also the point that you raised, created with the government of Uganda, and also that the trust, it doesn't just involve the funds that you have in the trust, but you're able to use that to catalyze additional funding. And it seems like a lot of the emphasis is around stimulating innovative enterprise within the communities that live around the conservation. So thank you for that really great example. And again, I'd urge everyone, if you have questions for particular panelists, just put it in the chat because we will get to them. Martin, now over to you. From a donor perspective, KfW has been a leader in helping support the development and operations and finance of conservation trust funds. Can you tell us a little bit about KfW's approach? Trust.
Thank you, Kathleen, and good afternoon to everybody. Before I go to the trust funds, perhaps some words about KfW. Are there any slides already coming? KfW is the government-owned promotional bank. That means that for everything Germany wants to promote and for which we need a bank, then KfW is asked to do it. So one thing, so next slide, please. One of these topics is financial development cooperation. So everybody knows the technical cooperation for which GIZ is responsible, and for everything which is financial cooperation, the KfW is asked to do it. And what the slide shows, it's clearly that it's everything we are doing in development cooperation and in biodiversity in Africa is a political priority of Germany and a political priority of the partner country. So it's not just we're looking at a project, but this has to fit into the political priorities of Germany and the partner country. Next slide, please. Going to the financial cooperation in protected areas. Here you see all our portfolio in the protected area management. So you see that in Africa, we support more than 100 protected areas in 23 countries and over 60 million hectares. And with a portfolio of more than 500 million euros, and in 2019, it expanded disbursement of more than 50 million. Next slide, please. We are coming now to the conservation trust funds. And on this slide, which is unfortunately only in German, but I think the figures are the same, the names as well. You see that in Africa, we are supporting 7 conservation trust funds and with more than 200 million euros. You see also, well, it's a bit small, but you see also the number 1 multiple times. And this is a new approach where we have created the Blue Action Fund together with other donors as well, and which can not only intervene in one country or one region, but it can intervene in all developing countries and is focused on coastal and marine areas. And we are presently creating also with other donors and philanthropes, private philanthropes, another trust fund, which is the Legacy Landscape Fund, which should focus more on very important terrestrial areas, and which can also then be active and financing protected areas where German development cooperation is not active. So coming back to the question, what we're looking at. And I think, well, the first question, of course, for us is, does it fit politically? So if it's located in a country where German development cooperation is not active, so we can just forget about it. So we're not open and free to look at all each and every trust fund. So then we are looking at the proposal, whether it's really the best option. Yeah? So first, is it the best option for sustainable financing? Or are there, let's say, easier options? For example, that we see, or in this country, tourism should be able somehow to finance it. Of course, this question now is looked at a bit differently with Corona, but let us say in former times, we have, of course, the impression that if you have a kind of Serengeti, which is a cash cow for a country, it's not really necessary to look at a conservation trust fund for assuring a sustainable financing. And there you have probably also other countries where tourism is a good, where you get sufficient revenue for it. And perhaps also you have other countries where you think from their economic power, they should be somehow able to finance their own protected areas. Then we look at the institutional setups. Is there not another institution already which can be used for this, for sustainable financing? Because let us say CTFs, if it's not already created, it's not a cheap option. It's quite difficult to create and to make it running, and it takes years and years and a lot of funds that it's really established. And then you have also to look at the governance. So who is behind the proposal of this trust fund? Do you have a sufficient, where you have a strong civil society? Is it very much dependent on government? Do you have a lot of NGOs behind? And you have to look at it, particularly from a sustainable point of view. So even if you have one active person, but this is not, if you don't have a perspective of really a sustainable structure, then it's also quite risky to start a conservation trust fund. Then, of course, what do we have as a donor? We have funds. And then we have to look at, so what are the financing needs? If you have particularly urgent financing needs, then it's sometimes questionable to spend a lot of funds in an institutional setup or in an endowment fund, but because you don't have enough funds for the urgent needs. Yeah? So therefore, really have to see whether this setup of an endowment fund is a good option. And those who are behind the initial idea 30, 25 years ago, there it was quite easy to get 6% without any risk. This situation has changed considerably. And if you remember the figure Katie said before, that only 20% obtain 3% of the endowments. So it's clear that I think endowment presently should never be the only option. It's one aspect of an endowment of a trust fund you can use, but it should never be let's say the solution we rely on. This is probably really not the best option. This is of course a donor has also different perspectives. For example, for KfW, for German Development Cooperation, we cannot finance into a sinking fund, for example. So this has to, we have to finance according to progress. And of course, therefore, we cannot have a project over 20 years. So there, sometimes for us, there are also some other limitations. So as a kind of summary, I think it's for those which are already created, it can be a very good option to support them. If you would ask me whether I would support a new creation presently of the conservation trust funds, I think there are a lot of obstacles behind to make the conservation trust fund the best option we would like to support. And with this, I would finish my short presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Martin. Really informative. And, you know, Katie started by highlighting some of the key attributes for conservation trust funds, you know, legal independence, government partnership, presence of NGOs, and you've ended as well with some of those key aspects. So thank you. And that's real practical information for people who are looking at either enhancing conservation trust funds or creating conservation trust funds. So if I can ask all of you on the panel, given your incredible experience, to build on that. What are the key enabling factors, enabling environments that are required for conservation trust funds? And again, some of you have already highlighted this, but are there key things that people really need to consider when creating and or expanding CTFs? Sean, do you want to start? You're in the middle of my screen, so I'm going to pick on you.
Okay, thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, I mean, there are some key enabling conditions that allow a trust fund to make sense from, as Martin was saying. I think it doesn't make any sense to do a CTF if you're really looking at a very small area where your financing needs aren't all that great, and therefore your endowment isn't going to, or where you don't have a lot of money coming in possibly for an endowment, where really your administration costs are going to be too high to make real sense out of that. That doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense if you're looking at priorities that are reasonably short-term or that could quickly be overcome in sort of a 5 or 10 year time perspective. In that case also, look at normal project funding. Trust funds make sense when you're looking at areas that need very, very long-term funding, but don't necessarily need the huge amounts. Because trust funds, as you say, it's hard to get more than 4 or 5% net return in your funds. And as a result, they're great for paying the ordinary, standard, you need it all the time, a small level of financing. For example, we're focused very much on operating costs, non-salary operating costs in parks. So it's mostly food rations, uniforms, communications, fuel for their vehicles, keeping their vehicles maintenance and stuff like that. It doesn't need to be a huge amount, but it can't suddenly drop off like a normal project. If a donor funding projects that go for 5 years and then stop, have a gap of a year, and then start again, where you're in a situation or in a country situation where that happens a lot, then it makes a lot of sense to have a trust fund that can smooth out those oscillations and really make a key difference. And so you're always there. If you don't feed your rangers in the bush, even for 2 months or 3 months, then they are going to eat the wildlife that you are supposed to be protecting. If you are in a situation which all of you who work in donor projects are, you know, it's so incredibly common to have those big gaps between projects. So those are really key areas where CTFs have an added value.
Great, thanks. Mark, I saw that you wanted to jump in. Thoughts from you on enabling environment? You're on mute.
The biggest challenge to you when you are starting a fund, you have to have a conservation challenge you are addressing. And that challenge must be very challenging. In other words, it has both threats and opportunities. And you have to manage the threats to make them into opportunities. That's how you can easily get funding for activities to do. And when you look at project planning, if you get money for a project and it ends and you end there, then you would have done nothing. So this trust fund keeps you, smoothens your journey through as you are looking for more funding to continue with the projects. And then the other important thing is you need a species that people will look up to. In our case, we had the gorilla, and the gorilla has become so good and sexy that people like to come and see it and want to maintain it to be there all the time. So you need to have something like that. And then government. Government is very key because like our operations, we don't have a big fund, but we have small funds. But government supplements us with tax exemptions so that we don't pay a lot of taxes. And that money that we would use for taxes, we use it to develop community projects. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. That's great. And you've addressed someone else's question, but I'll get to that one later. Katie and Martin, do you have some additions to that question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think Sean and Mark already mentioned very important aspects of this conservation trust funds, the preconditions to make it worthwhile. I would add that we need to look at who will run the trust fund. So look at the civil society behind the trust fund, whether this is a viable concept. Then if as a donor perspective for endowments, then to make it worthwhile to have a capital, look at a perspective of at least 50 million euro or dollars. That makes it worthwhile really to manage this kind of thing and not to eat up all the revenues of a capital. And to achieve this, of course, having the interest of difficult to obtain, of course, aspects from.
Katie?
Yeah, I just want to echo everything all three of them have said. I think it's also really vital to ensure that there's multi-stakeholder support, so it can't be something that's being driven by one or just one organization. The importance of connecting with communities and with the small national NGOs, as well as understanding the priorities of the international donors and international NGOs. Martin pointed to the importance of scale, and I think that's vital, and that includes really understanding, in a lot of cases, there is not a need to create a new conservation trust fund or a new fund because there's already an existing institution. And so doing that analysis to see, do we really need to create a new institution, or is there already a body in place that can perhaps set up a new program account, integrate the transaction costs and overhead of an entirely new institution. So, and then lastly, to the point about scale of capitalization, really having a robust business plan from the beginning and capitalizing early. So hoping that capital is going to come in down the road has not been as successful as the funds that are really able to plan up front and plan to capitalize early, and then using that capital to leverage additional funds. The CTFs that we've seen with the greatest degree of success have been the ones that leveraged early funding to bring in more funding, and that has been a vital success element.
Great. Thanks.
Leveraging other funding is really important. I think one of the other useful enabling conditions is when you have quite a lot of donors in a space that have, different cycles and different rules, but they all want to sort of help the same end results or end beneficiaries. Like in a protected area network, it can often be very, very useful function of a trust fund to just harmonize donor procedures and channels, so that even in a landscape, key role in sort of getting all the different donors to play by the same rules. It's so much easier for a park to function if it only has one set of operational procedures it has to obey, and not 5 or 6 or 7 different ones with different funding cycles and different timings and different report templates and so on. So I think those are other places where, again, harmonizing that, using that leveraging force of a trust fund to get more funding, to get donor funding in, and paying.
That's just about conservation trust funds and the ability of conservation trust funds to shift away from crisis funding. And, you know, Katie, one of the things that you pointed out in that report, which looked at the last 10 years of CTFs, is that what CTFs has enabled organizations and foundations to do is to be more creative and to be more innovative and to shift away from that crisis funding. Is that a fair assessment? And can all of you comment on that? So that was a question from someone in the audience. Katie, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think that is absolutely true. That most of the role of CTFs is to provide long-term sustainability, and so having predictable funding cycles. Sean talked about the predictability that comes from a revenue stream from an endowment, even when there is market volatility that affects returns. Well-managed investment funds are smoothing those returns over time and managing for a predictable income stream, and that does help to provide the sustainability that avoids sort of boom and bust funding cycles. And then, definitely what we've seen in a number of conservation trust funds has been the ability to provide sustainability during times of political turmoil, times of economic turmoil. That long-term focus means that you're not necessarily in a position where you have to keep chasing funding, where you're behind the curve as opposed to ahead of the curve. So that doesn't, of course, it doesn't remove all crisis. It doesn't remove all uncertainty, but it does help to provide some smoothing and sustainability for protected areas as well as for community conservation programs.
Great, thanks. Mark, there's a slew of questions for you. And so I'll try to summarize them, but do you mind clarifying for everyone how much funding the trust has raised to date and who supported that, and what role the government played in the establishment and the funding of the CTF? Okay. And I'll add one more, but I'll remind you, and that is how the fund is managed. Yes. Is there professional management of the finances?
The funding that we got from Jeff, basically the money that they made us take off. But USAID gave us $1 million. The Royal Netherlands government gave us $1.7 million as sinking funds to start with, as the $6 million from Jeff is making more money. We built the office, provided the necessary conditions, the environment, the tax environment, the registration process to make us a trust fund that is actually jointly run by government and the civil society, because our board is composed of 3 ministries: Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Finance, and Ministry of Justice, to give us legal and political backing. And then we have private sector people, we have community members, we have tourism members of the tourism board, we have Uganda Wildlife Authority, we have people of integrity from society, of capital, who have capital, who are businessmen, to help us also understand managing the trust as a business. So we are independent. Government doesn't give us direction. We work on our own. And I lead the secretariat, but we have a board which is led currently by Mr. Manda, who is the chairman, who is the executive director of Uganda Wildlife Authority. The funding was raised basically because when they made the protected areas, the gorillas were going away. And when they made them protected, they came with police. And police was forcing people to get out, but people would go there. And the poaching, the threats were increasing. So they said, what can we do? They approached the Global Environment Fund, and they brought this fund to help smoothen the landing of, because people were using these forests for timber, for everything. They were getting things from the forests. But now they put a quarantine on them. So it became a conflict area. So we started as a conflict managing trust. And in terms of the investment manager, we have an investment manager. The fund is invested offshore, it is invested in America. And the investment manager was hired professionally, competitively, and selected. And we found, actually, we didn't know, when we selected him, we found that he's the one who even works for BioFund. And we have been very happy with him because he has managed our fund. Even when other funds are going down, ours has remained constant.
Great.
And private funding, we get also private funding, private sector actually. We have an organization called Swarovski. Swarovski is a company in Austria. Out of their social responsibility, they gave us 2 million euros, which we used to do the water schools and the water for communities, the gravity scheme. So when we identify opportunities outside with private sector, even locally here, we get funding from there. What was the other question?
That was it. And actually, great segue to the next question. You must have been reading my mind. We had a question from Sean Mann about any success in leveraging private capital. And so, you know, Mark, you mentioned that. Sean, that's something that you're focusing on. Do you want to answer that question in terms of success in leveraging private capital for the BioFund?
Sure. I think there are different ways you can talk about leveraging private capital. One of the ways that you're looking at is private capital that's being invested in conservation businesses already. So you're looking, and I think this is probably one thing we often don't do enough of, and certainly most donors don't do enough of it because donors don't like giving to for-profit entities. But in fact, it's many of the for-profit entities, if we're looking at certainly in Southern Africa, 2/3 of the area that is protected is in the hands of the private sector, and it's being managed by them for-profit businesses of a variety of different types. Now, leveraging that money means supporting some of their core costs in times when they have no revenue, or helping them expand into new areas of commercial interest that is also conservation interest. If you can expand the area that they manage and make it more profitable for them and allow them to expand into a bigger area, in fact, you've had a huge, big footprint. And you've supported much less than you do in a public area where, in fact, you have to support 100% of all the costs. With the private sector making money out of it, they're also kicking in. So that's a private sector leveraging one type. Private sector leveraging in terms of them piggybacking on donor initiatives that they all do to. It's some support fund for prizes each year to the best rangers in the country. And you know, this is an initiative that a number of companies liked. And so we've had a number of private sector entities come to us and say, oh, we can contribute this as well. We'd like to give you a little bit of money to add to this particular purpose as well. And so where there's a very specific output that they can point to, then it often looks good for their corporate social responsibility aspects. Private sector leverage can also be in terms of their obligations and creating new legal obligations for private sector. And that's what we are working on, for example, with biodiversity offsets. Telling people upfront that if you're going to sit into what you destroy, now that's a cost of doing business. And now all of a sudden there is a need to do restoration at a much higher level than there was previously. And so you've created a new legal obligation and you're leveraging the private sectors in some way. You can see it as leveraging, or you can see it as actually just creating the legal framework that requires them to do more biodiversity conservation than they would do by themselves. So that's a number of different ways in which you see private sector being involved directly in conservation in ways that make sense for places like Mozambique, at least.
Great, thanks, Sean. Next question came from Anne, and her question, Martin, if you can take this one, that would be great. But Anne is asking about working in politically unstable areas and how that's usually a deterrent for investment. So can you talk a little bit about conservation trust funds that have been set up in conflict areas? And Sean is smirking because he thinks Mozambique has conflict. Mark's already mentioned conflict in Uganda. So I suppose the question, what is conflict? And I'll hand that over to you, Martin.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, I think the funds won't be invested, let us say the capital won't be invested in conflict areas. And also, we of course look also at the legal framework conditions. And therefore, you see a lot of African trust funds are somehow located the offshore, either in Germany or in UK. And so the funds are secured. And only, let us say, the conservation expenditure is, of course, done in conflict areas. And there, for sure, the CTFs have a lot of advantages because they have a stable revenue, or they can mobilize stable funds. And so they are not dependent, they can compensate crisis of other finance. And I think this is one of the major advantages. And let us say, even if, for example, NGOs have difficulties mobilizing funds because of political decisions, I don't know, Trump administration, also what. And so the conservation trust funds, they can still continue financing. This was, for example, in Central African Republic, this was certainly a huge advantage of the CTF during the crisis in this country. Therefore, I don't see this as a big problem.
Great, thanks, Martin. Katie, there was a question about someone has shared their experience in leveraging funding from EU fisheries agreements for marine protected areas. And their question is if there are any other examples of CTFs that have been able to successfully leverage that kind of funding.
I was actually just about to write back to Ahmed in the chat, so I'm happy to answer that. I actually think that BIOPAMA arrangement is fairly unique, but I think it's an area where there's increasing interest, particularly I'm seeing it more in the Asia Pacific and the Pacific Ocean areas where so much of the revenue is coming from fishing licenses that creating CTFs that are able to leverage those funding streams can be really important. But I actually do think BIOPAMA's that particular arrangement is more one that the rest of the CTFs can learn from than that there are other examples. Certainly, leveraging of other funding streams is, you know, as Sean was pointing out, is an important role that CTFs can play, and looking at ways that existing legal agreements can be used for leverage, I think are an important opportunity for CTFs.
Great, thank you. We are going to have to wrap up questions in about 2 minutes. So what I'd like to do is hand it over to each of you. Any lasting comments comments or remarks that you want to make, again, for people who are looking at creating? So why don't I start with you, Mark? Any last comments that you'd like to make? Oh, you're on mute. Mark, you're on mute.
I'm answering Nicholas King. He is asking how we made 5.7 in a period of 8 years. This period, we had a year where our investment manager made a profit of 1.5 in 1 year. And that boosted the capital a lot. But still, the money is cumulative and we don't withdraw the profit. So we get money that we need to use. There are years where when we have operational fund, we don't withdraw from the endowment fund. So the endowment fund grows in perpetuity. But effectively, there are times when we don't make that money. Like in 2008, we lost a lot of money. But money you invest in an endowment fund is money that is at risk, but is also a good investment because it makes money and also loses money. And that's how money is made. So I wanted to clarify to King that when you invest outside, especially in an environment which has stability in the economy, you are sure that you'll be able to get money if you have a good investment manager.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Katie, any concluding remarks?
Well, I certainly want to echo that point, coming from the perspective of looking at the CTF's investment management, that the role of expert professional advice in investment management is critical, and CTFs are not there to be asset managers. They're not there to pick stocks. They're not there even to, identify which funds are the right place to go. They're there to serve as fiduciaries, which does certainly echoing Mark's point there. And I think just more broadly, what I would highlight is that that CTFs are really one donor who spoke on a panel for us recently said CTFs are sexy again, and I think that's a fun way to think about the fact that they are increasingly emerging as leaders in their own communities, in their own countries, and they play a critical and vital role. And so there's a lot that can be learned from them. But to Martin's earlier point, there are very high transaction costs in creating one. And so looking for ways to partner with existing institutions and to really be sure that there is the right reason to create a long-term sustainable institution, because it's not a silver bullet. It's a tool and an important one, but certainly not without cost to set up.
Great, thanks, Katie. Martin, any concluding remarks from you?
Yes, thank you. I think it was made clear during this presentation that these CTFs are not just an endowment fund and you live from the endowment fund, but to make a good CTF, you have a variety of instruments to use. And I think Sean pointed out very clearly how many instruments you can use. And I think you should use and not just rely on an endowment fund. Well, if you have $150 million, okay, you can do it. But I think most of them have not, and they should look for other income streams. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Great point. Last but not least, Sean, any concluding remarks from you?
Yeah, perhaps just for those of you thinking of CTFs, you've got a great history now of practice. Use those practice standards, the link that Katie put up. Don't reinvent the wheel. There's lots of experience out there. Repeat the good stuff. Listen to some of these things. Look at the good funds around and see do you meet those preconditions? Can you get to scale? Do you have some donors interested in starting up? Are your transaction costs going to be worth it in terms of the longevity of your fund and the amount of funding you're eventually going to be able to mobilize? And if so, follow the practice standards. There's quite clear ways to do it wrong, and there's quite clear ways now on how to do it right. And I guess maybe my last piece of information would be get the right people involved right at the beginning. If you get a good board off to start, a really one that's well connected, very interested in making biodiversity conservation work, and has the right motivation to work for it, you'll get a good trust fund. If you get a lot of people who are there just, well, you know, maybe I'll just go and show up, then it's going to end up being a weak, poorly run and poorly managed fund. So get the right people in right from the beginning, and it makes all the difference in the world.
Great, fantastic. Thank you to all of you. Incredible knowledge and experience. And yes, great last words in terms of build on that experience and take advantage of the materials that have been provided. So Christine, over to you for wrapping up.
Thanks, Kathleen. And yes, also I want to echo that. Thank you so much to all the panelists for the extremely interesting contributions. I certainly learned a huge amount. And thank you, Kathleen, for so expertly moderating the session as well again for us. It really was a great afternoon with all of you again. And thanks also to all the participants for your great questions and your keen interest in what the panelists presented here. We did post, and I'm sure all of you have seen by now, a number of links, but I think the key link, we will send you all an email in the next few days with the link to this recording. It will also have the link to all the resources, the presentations, etc. So you will get that. Don't worry, if you didn't save the chat or anything like that, you will have access to those links. And I wanted to just briefly draw your attention now again to the survey to help us to continue, hopefully, to put together such similarly interesting and relevant events. So the survey link has just been posted in the chat, I see. So if you could please take a few minutes now to just give us your feedback on this series, this event, and give us your ideas about other topics that you would be particularly interested in. And I'm sort of looking at the panelists a bit. If you have a few more minutes to spend perhaps on some of the questions that might not have been answered, that would be much appreciated. But if not, and any of you in the audience still have burning questions that were not answered, you can email me and I can try and see if I can get hold of our panelists to engage with you specifically on that. And then lastly, I'd just like to thank the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States and the European Union for their support for BIOPAMA, who's hosting this event. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to do this. So just a quick thank you on that side. And from me, I think that's it. This series of events on sustainable financing closes with this event for now, but that's why we're looking forward to hearing from you to see what else you would like to hear. And if relevant, we may continue with a few more sustainable financing options. That depends a bit on what feedback you provide. So thanks, everybody. Have a lovely afternoon. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks very much.